Hello, everyone. I want to share my story of what it was like to lose my grandmother when I was in elementary school, when I was in fifth grade. So I remember that I was over at my aunt's house and I was angry with my grandmother about something silly. I don't know what it was, but I was angry with my grandmother and I expressed this to my grandmother one night, and my grandmother just listened to me, you know, go on and on or about nothing. And then she didn't, she wasn't mean or anything. She just listened to me just to hear what I had to say. Now, some months later, when it was summer break, then my grandmother invited me to go on a trip with her. And we went out of town to visit my aunt and uncle. And I liked going out of town with my grandmother because I don't know, I hadn't been out of town. So we ended up taking a bus, a Greyhound bus, out of town. And I remember taking pictures along the way of like what was along the road, like different landscapes and all that and stuff. And I don't know what it was, but to me, my grandmother has always looked the same to me, you know. But what I didn't realize is that my grandmother had aged, and I didn't really notice that very much at all. To me, she just looked her same. I mean, she was retired and everything, but I didn't really think much of her looking old or anything like that. So when we go and visit my aunt and uncle, we had a really good time and stuff. I met my uncle for the first time because my aunt had gotten married, and I met her new husband and everything. And my grandmother and I had a really good time and stuff. We got to go different places out of town and everything like that. And we had a great time. So when we came back and I went to school, I didn't really think too much about my grandma because, my grandma, she's always been around my entire life. So, I didn't know, anything about my grandmother being sick or anything like that. So at one point, I had found out that my grandmother and my auntie, they had went gambling or whatever. And my grandmother, she had passed out when they were gambling and stuff. And she was rushed to the hospital. And then she was in the hospital. I'm not sure for how long. It's probably a short while. But I got more of an understanding. I didn't know at the time, but my grandmother had had a stroke. And my mother had went to the hospital. And when my mom went to the hospital, my mom found out that my grandmother had passed away. And my mom was so brave to go into the room where they had been working on my grandmother. And it was just my mom and my grandmother. And this time my grandmother had passed away. And my mom was so brave to go in there. And my mom talked about to me how, like, on one side of my grandmother's body, she felt so, like, cool on one side of her body, like cold. And on the other side of her body, like, my grandmother was sweating and it was burning up hot. And I feel like my mom had so much strength to be able to do that because I don't think I would have been able to do that. But as a kid, I really didn't, I didn't have a understanding about death or anything like that. To me, my grandmother wasn't sick. She was always so active. She was always going walking. She was always, she had a lot of friends. She was just someone that would listen to you. She was so wise. She always knew what to say. She even listened to rap music. you know? Um, like my grandmother was definitely hip, like she was like hip with the times. And like to me, my grandmother was young at heart. And like when I was talking about like my grandmother, like I didn't notice her aging or anything. I remember like after my grandmother had passed away, like a year after, I was looking at some pictures of my grandmother and I when we were on that trip. And when I looked at the pictures, I saw how my grandmother had aged. But to me, when we went on the trip, my grandmother looked as young and vibrant as she always did. So that kind of surprised me. But it literally took me, in elementary school, it took me a year to be able to look at my grandmother's pictures, you know. And when you're a kid and you lose your grandma, somebody has always been there for you, and then they're gone. It's confusing. I mean, even when I went to the funeral, it was confusing because I didn't know that meant my grandmother was gone. I didn't know that. I had no idea. She was just it's like she just disappeared. And then going to the funeral, like I saw my grandmother's obituary, but I didn't know that meant she was gone, like she was never coming back. And I remember going to the cemetery. Like my family went to the cemetery, and my grandmother's children went to the cemetery. And I remember my two uncles, and they were arguing. My grandmother's two eldest sons were arguing over her grave at the cemetery, and it was just this very tense moment. And it was so like I was so disappointed in my uncles for how they were acting, you know, at their mother's grave, and they're just acting like that. I mean, even as a kid, I thought it was ridiculous, you know? Losing a grandmother is not easy. Losing anybody in your life is not easy, no matter who it is. But when you're a kid, you don't know that when you lose your grandma, that they're really gone and they're not coming back. And to me, as time wore on, I just accepted my grandmother's absence, but I guess I really didn't know how to really, what to really think, you know? I guess I accepted that she was gone, but I guess as a kid I didn't want to really face those feelings because I was in school, and so like everything else was happening and stuff. I was going to middle school and everything, and I think it kind of faded into the background for me because when I got to middle school, I was so excited about that, and time wore on, and I just sort of like the loss just kind of faded into the background for me.